Hi guys, welcome to the Sprint 17 of ORE Studio, the demo. There's a lot of stuff to talk about in this demo, so I'm going to try my best not to lose track of what I'm talking about because there's so much stuff in this sprint. It was a very atypical sprint, so I'm just going to hop over here to Emacs, or maybe even the browser really. So as you can see here, the release has been created. So as I said, this was a very atypical release because normally I try not to pack too much stuff into a release. I used to be quite disciplined back in the Dogen days. Well, I wouldn't say quite, but I was to be a little bit disciplined. And I used to try to keep releases down to around 80 hours worth of effort. The idea being that you don't want the releases to become a little bit too random. You want them to have a little bit of a focus, a bit of a mission and so on. And if you have a release with, like we had here, for example, with 800 commits, and Lord knows how many pull requests we got on this release, all done by me with Claude, as you can imagine, that's just a bit too much, which then means that things such as the sprint mission become more like a Bible rather than a mission, and it all gets a bit jumbled up. And really, if you think about it, this release was done, well, just today really, which is the 22nd, and if I go back to the previous release, we'll see that was almost a month ago, a bit over a month ago. So that's really not ideal, especially when you're committing a lot. But the reason why that was the case was because we had the Quant Summit, the ORE Quant Summit, which was smack bang in the middle of the sprint. And I was trying really hard to see if I could get ORE Studio to a point where I could actually do a demo. I could take it to the ORE Summit, the Quant Summit, at least with my laptop, and if anyone was interested, maybe after over drinks and so on. Nothing official really, but just something I could use to demonstrate. In the end, even though I tried really hard to get it up and running, it just wasn't to be. There was just too much stuff going on at the moment, and there is still too much stuff going on. And the code is just a little bit too unstable for other people to get involved. And so I decided against it in the end. I mean, I will do this demo as a way to show progress and just to show where we are. But as you can see, or as you will see by the end of this demo, there's just so many moving parts at present and so much instability that makes it really hard for somebody who wants to just have a look and coming from the outside world. So hopefully the demo will be a good way for all the people that I spoke to in the presentations in ORE, the Quant Summit, should I say. There was quite a few people. I brought my t-shirt, which I'm wearing at present. You won't be able to see it, but I bought my ORE Studio t-shirt, and I also had my cards, which was also a useful thing to do, as recommended by my wife. And so a number of people asked me for my cards, asked me for some just a blurb or just a general overview of what's going on with ORE Studio, what am I trying to do, what's the objective, and so on. So I had a lot of chats with a lot of people, and as a consequence, a lot of people reached out afterwards on LinkedIn. So this is also a bit of a reply to all of those that asked me questions about it. So Sprint 17, we're on the road to 1.0. There's probably going to be a number of these until we get to 1.0. We had to do a lot of changes in the sprint, changes to process, changes to pretty much everything really. So I'll try to cover all of that. I think it's going to be a very long video. I've tried not to make it too long. So the first thing would start is by saying that there's still a lot of redness going on, as you can see here. I do think that the OS X builds probably just some kind of weird transient issue. Not entirely sure, to be honest. We were building OS X until not so long ago, and that was looking good. But I think I might have done something to break it. Not entirely sure. But Windows is our biggest problem at the moment. And so basically we lost 2 out of 3 of our operating systems. Linux is always, everything's fine with Linux, no big problem there. The big problem we're having at the moment is with one of the libraries that we use quite a lot, which is RFL. It's a great library. RFL CPP perhaps. Yeah, Reflect CPP. So this is a great library. We use this quite a lot, and one of the main reasons why we use it is because we use SQLGen. But MSVC being MSVC and our types being a little bit big, we have bumped into an issue where the const_expr depth that MSVC is able to support is not large enough for it to parse some of our more complicated types, and as a result we are getting a lot of error. Actually, to be honest, this is not the error that I was trying to show you. This is probably a Clang error actually, so this is just an export error. We can fix that, that's not a problem. The MSVC ones are the ones that are trickier, which is this guy here. I mean, we've tried increasing our const_expr depth to large amounts, but do as we try, we try as we may, we just don't seem to be able to get MSVC to parse these. And the reason why, to be fair to MSVC, is that this trade type that we've got is a bit large. So if I just hop over to projects, trading, in fact I think it's probably the API. I don't think we split trade. Oh, we did. Okay, so if I just go over here and look for trade, it seems that when the way that Reflect C++ is designed, it attempts to take a type and then it attempts to find if there are duplicates using some kind of algorithm that's actually O(n)(. It's obviously a compile time algorithm, but because we have so many types inside of our trade type, and each of these types of course has got their own fields and so on, it seems to make Reflect C++ go a little bit over the edge when it comes to MSVC. It is using this some very clever compile time macro that well, macro is not quite the right word, but some kind of expansion of compile time, which ensures that there are no duplicates in the fields, and basically we just don't seem to be able to get this thing to compile on MSVC. So the chap that runs Reflect C++ is a very nice chap. I've had quite a number of conversations. I mean, if you go to SQLGen, which is another of his projects, you will see that I have done a number of pull requests, obviously thanks to Claude, to help things out. And as you can see here, this chap is extremely responsive. So we will need to, it's one of my pull requests, is extremely responsive. So we just need to go back to him and try to understand what's the best way of dealing with types such as the types that we've got here, which seem to be a little bit too, they seem to have too many fields. I mean, what you see here now is already our attempt at splitting this into substructs, because originally, if I quickly have a look at the history of this class, we should see not so long ago, maybe around this time. Yeah, as you can see here, this used to be a much larger type with lots of properties, and I then split it into substructs, which to be fair is probably the right thing to do, with the different aspects of the trade, but it still doesn't seem to solve the problem. So as a result, at the moment, we are not really able to build windows using MSVC or Clang. The reason why I'm not able to build with Clang is separate. It's to do with the fact that we've changed visibility, and you'll see this in the release notes. We changed visibility to hidden by default. It's not entirely clear to me why Linux seems to be working fine, but Windows doesn't. I would have thought if there's a visibility issue that would come up in both Windows and Linux and OS X. But nonetheless, we haven't quite got to the bottom of that. So as a result, I was trying really hard to get the build screen before we closed the sprint, but like I said, we've had so many pull requests and commits in this release that it didn't make a lot of sense to continue. It was just, the mess was just becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. So I just decided to take a call and say, well, for this release, we just don't have builds for those operative systems. And it's tough, but those are the kind of calls you need to make when you're running a project, especially in your spare time. So that was one, and you'll see in this release that a lot of the efforts were probably done 14 or 15 pull requests, as I think somewhere around here here we go. We've attempted some 14 different hotfixes trying to resolve this issue. Quite a lot of variations. Some of them was just going around in a circle, but we didn't really get to the bottom of it. So that's something else to look forward to for the Sprint 18. That was one thing. Another thing that was extremely time-consuming this sprint. For that, you need a bit of context, I guess. So if I just go up to our sort of legacy project, which is my PhD thesis. So back in the day where I used to run this little code generation project, I used to have a very organized way of managing my time. I used to just have a sprint backlog, which was just a simple org mode sheet. I used to capture my time here. I used to have all my tasks, and I used to just basically put all my notes as part of the sprint, and I had a one-stop shop to find all the information that I needed for that sprint. And like I said, once you reach sufficient time, this is a short sprint, but once you've done enough in the sprint, whatever that enough was, we would call it a day, move on to the next sprint, and so on. And then we tried over time, we sort of refined this. If I move over to the next version, over time this process was refined, and by the time we got to the last few sprints, we were running a pretty tight ship when it came to management of time. It was working quite well. As you can see, there's an 80-hour sprint here. It doesn't still have a sprint. Oh, we do have a sprint goals, right? Didn't have a mission. We have goals just to guide us through the sprint. And then, yeah, as you can see here, all the stuff from the sprint would be part of this. Then at the end of the sprint, we used to do the release notes for the sprint, which was all done by hand. And then there will be some long form text, including a demo, such as the demo we're doing right now. And then in here, again, by hand, I would go through the sprint and I'll do some reflections, which was my retrospective. And then I just basically reflect on the work that I did. And this was quite useful, and it was extremely useful for my PhD. But this was all done, well, let's see when the last release was. Good 4 years ago. That basically was, the whole thing was done manually. There was no LLMs. I mean, there were LLMs at the time, but I just didn't use them. Probably were not mature enough to do anything useful. And that basically meant that sprints were quite linear, which is another way of saying that there was one person working on one story. Sometimes I used to pause the story, move to another story, and so on, but it was, in general, it was quite straightforward. It was very linear, even though there may have been some non-linearities. There were just one person managing the non-linearities. Moving on to the current state of the world is a bit different. I now tend to have 3 or 4 Claudes running at the same time. Each of them are doing some work that I'm trying to keep track of. And really, if you look at the sprint logs, we started with the same approach. If you look at the sprint logs that we had, in fact, we won't be able to do that because everything has been sort of changed. But if I go up to tags, and let's say, for example, I'll go to the previous sprint, then I'll go to doc and then agile. And then very much like with Doja, and you would see that there's a number of sprint backlogs here, and you'll probably recognize instantly from the previous backlog that I just showed you that we're very, very similar. We have a sprint mission, what we're working on. We have a number of stories. Again, sprint 16 was already a bit larger than expected, but as you can see here. But this mess that was starting prior to sprint 16 was related to LLM integration with this process. With LLMs, we stopped having linearity, and what happens with LLMs is that you end up doing a lot of tasks all at the same time. Sometimes you start a task and then you end up, that task becomes a drift into 3 or 4 different tasks, and then you end up with, which is the most common situation for us at the moment, pull requests with very large number of commits, which is something that really I profoundly dislike, especially in the context of an LLM. I mean, if you look at some of our pull requests, for instance, if I just look here at our V7, or V2, sorry, see if I can find a V2. If I look at our V2 pull request, this was absolutely, oh actually this is, well, I did try to start offloading stuff, but I'm sure if you look around here, you're going to find pull requests with at least tens, some of them many tens of commits, which is really, really not what we want. From experience, I've decided that this is really not a good idea. I mean, if you read some of my texts, not that you would want to, but just in case you're interested, if you read some of my texts, one of the conclusions that I reached not so long ago was on the pull request driven development, and I went on a ramble here, which is a pretty long ramble, that explains the advantages of driving your entire cycle of work via pull requests. And one of the things I mentioned in this post is that your pull request should be small. It should be very easy to review. It should be almost binary. I should be able to just open up the pull request. I should be able to read the description of the pull request, which are becoming bigger and bigger. I should be able to look at the commit, so the file's changed even. And this should just be a function that should apply to the changes that I see here. And I should be able to say, yeah, okay, I get it. This is actually correct, or this is incorrect. I mean, of course, you know, this is the limit of the idea, the limit of the function of this review. But in theory, we want to converge towards that limit. We want small pull requests that are really easy to diff and to review. And I think that's just good for humans as it is good for machines, because we use Gemini quite a lot for reviews. As you can see here, we have quite a lot of review comments here, which we did not address, which reminds me, we should probably have a look at this pull request. In general, we tend to address these review comments, at least mark them as a result if we don't agree with them. But the larger your pull request, the worse the job Gemini is going to do, and of course Claude locally as well. So you don't really want large pull requests. But our system of bookkeeping was just not good enough to keep track of the work. So we needed to invent a new system, and I spent some time reading up on something called cybernetics, which is basically a way of managing complex systems. It's a very old theory from the 60s and 40s that talks a lot about feedback loops and so on. So one of the changes that we did, which was also a pretty painful change, but we're still working on, is we migrated all of the work that we had that was in that linear form, including a lot of the documents, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them, of the documents, over to this sort of slightly more cybernetic way of doing things. And what do I mean? Well, I'm not really going to go too much on a rant here about cybernetics. If you really want to read up a little bit about it, we tried to put some pointers. If you just find cybernetic levels, it provides you with some pointers, and it gives you some ideas of what these systems are and so on. But the gist of it really, if you take away all the complexities of cybernetics, the gist of it is we're trying to make things smaller and self-contained so that we can start to go backwards to the world of easy to review pull requests. And the way that works now is a story becomes sort of what we call here system 2 kind of operation, and it's broken down into tasks, and the tasks are a system 1 operation, which is what we're actually going to be pull requesting on. And so as an example, we can, so in order to test this, because we haven't actually managed to use this in Anger yet, but we went through all of the documentation of all the previous sprints, and we took those documents and we parsed it and processed them into the new format. So if I go back here to orientation and I look for Agile, you got all these explanations here. I mean, as you can see, all the documentation has been rewritten to fit this new world. But more importantly, let's say we take a sprint, like sprint 17. We should really update that because we're just about to open sprint 18. So as you can see here, the page of the sprint now is a bit different. First, we don't worry too much about clocking anymore. The reason why is because clocking is very difficult when you've got multiple Claudes running around. So what's time in a distributed environment is actually not a trivial question. I almost get into relativity here. And so instead of worrying about time, we're going to have the wall clock, which is basically our way of saying, okay, we've roughly done about 80 hours. It doesn't really matter. We just start, for example, we would say, you're starting a sprint today, and then let's just measure whatever, maybe, I don't know, 8-10 days of effort. And the second variable we're going to use as well as a measurement is we're just going to look at the commit count and the pull request count. We're going to try to keep the commit count and pull request count around 200 or something like that at most, and the pull request count similarly, numbers that are not too high. I think we had 90 or so 100 pull requests or something, which is a bit too much. So we want to keep that number down. So that plus the hours is going to be our sort of mechanism to determine when enough's enough. We'll also have, as we always had, the notion of mission to try to keep us focused on what we're trying to achieve with the sprint. And then within the sprint we have a story, which is more or less what you would think of a story like in Agile. The stories are documented in these pages, and then there's some bookkeeping here for the story just to keep track of what's going on. But the most important bit is that the story is then broken down into tasks, and the tasks are what the LLM will execute. The LLM will execute these tasks, and once it's done with the task, we'll mark that task as complete, and then we'll move on until all the tasks in the story are complete. And when that's done, we will consider the story to be done. And similarly, once we finished all the stories in the sprint, we will consider the sprint to be done. And we have processes for all these things, and these processes are all documented, just to make sure that the LLM, and then the other thing that's important is we try to automate as much as possible these processes. Another of the problems we had, which was also quite problematic, was that we were not making the best use of skills. Our skills were gigantic, really, if I'm honest. And because they were gigantic, Claude couldn't really use them very well. So we refactored all of the skills now to become, at most, a page full, a screen full, really. And then instead of actually putting the details of the tasks that we want to execute, well, the task is not quite right. What we now call recipes, basically, the procedures, the processes, we move those out into recipes. And these recipes follow the form of an FAQ. And so the LLM would now say, well, I want to do question, how do I do it, answer. And these are all org Babel, so you can actually execute all this stuff inside of Emacs. It should just work, which is good, which is a good way of us to test that everything is working as expected. And the recipes are very, very focused, and anything that is required to understand the concept of the recipe we link via org-rome. Interestingly enough, we seem to have a problem here, but that should have rendered. In fact, let's just very quickly, I don't want to get too lost here, but very quickly, let's just double check. It is likely that all components are broken. We have changed so much stuff in the documents that it's very likely there's a few links that are going to be broken. So that changed the documentation to this new format, this new website, everything, as you see here, was quite painful. It's taken many days of just faffing around, really, until we kind of got things in a good shape. And I can't really say for sure this is going to work. I just know that the previous thing was not working because documents were too big, everything was all over the place. Claude does not really like very large documents. So for example, a product backlog contained every single story that we ever had, which meant that Claude had difficulties finding stories. So now instead we have a product backlog where we split things into buckets like we did before, but the buckets are now directories. And then we have these indices, like for example the near bucket, and these contain these captures, and the capture now just has a paragraph or two or whatever much we've got for the capture about the subject that we want to talk about. And for the LLM, it's really easy to just open up this document. So we can easily say to the LLM, just have a quick look to see if we already done some work on this before. The LLM could easily grab by metadata. So if you look at one of these documents, which are all standardized now, if you look at a document, like for instance, let's say we go to the product backlog and we go to near. So any of these documents, I mean, you need to look at it raw. There's plenty of org mode metadata explaining what this document is. It contains things such as the description. It contains things such as the type, and it and even tags, which allows the LLM via some clever scripts that we wrote to just basically say, find me all captures that we've got, and then show me the descriptions, which will give you a list that will not be too dissimilar to this list here. In fact, this list is generated via script. And so given this list, the LLM very, very quickly can narrow it down to 3 or 4 stories that it thinks may be relevant to the thing you're kind of working on. Some of these stories are in better shape, but some are in a worse shape, but it doesn't really matter. The key point is that we don't lose our captures, and then at some point we will run skills such as backlog refinement, which I believe we already have. Maybe not. But if you look at the meta skills and even the agile skills, you would see that are skills that we have to do with the documents. So if we don't have one yet, which I thought we did, but if we don't have one yet, we could easily create a very simple skill that says every so often go through every single capture and just trim them down, delete, merge, and so on, just to make sure the backlog doesn't quite get too crazy, which was a problem before because it was one gigantic document and it was really difficult to run backlog grooming, sorry, not grooming anymore. What do we call it these days? Backlog refinement or backlog combing. It was quite difficult to do it in a very large file. So now it's much easier. And we basically updated all the documentation to fit this format. As you can see, the diagrams, which should be a little bit more up to date now, should all be coming through now, except for that SQL for some reason. And you can also see that I'm running the site locally, which is another of the changes in the sprint. Before it was a bit painful. I mean, you could run the site, but really what we used to do is we used to just go with the browser to the location where the HTML files were, the generated HTML, which was okay, it worked, but we've done a lot of changes to the site and some use cases broke. In particular, one of the things we tried to do with this very large change to the documentation, we tried to add a knowledge graph. So there is already some very basic support. Well, there is already support. I mean, what you're seeing here is nothing that I've done. This is all org mode, org Rome. But what we did is we hacked effectively org Rome to allow non-Emacs rendering of the knowledge base, of the knowledge graph. And so what you see here is the knowledge graph, the entire knowledge graph of ORE Studio with all the document types and all the linkages between them. So for example, these are the cybernetic functions. And this it is not yet live because we have broken the build yet again. But this will be fixed soon and hopefully will be deployed into the live website. As you can see, there is no knowledge graph there. But it is quite useful, and hopefully it's also something that we can improve on. These clusters are quite useful, quite informative. I mean, we've got pretty much every document that we've got inside of the website. Some of them are not linked. We will probably create some rules to check for nodes that are orphaned, for which the knowledge graph does not reach. Everything should really reach. But that was not something we could have done in the previous sprint. So this is quite useful. It enables you to browse all the stuff that we are working on. And of course, the really useful thing about this is, like the Obsidian version of this, once the LLM is fully working in tasks and sprints and so on via our approach, all of the work the LLM does will be part of the knowledge graph. So if I'm interested in knowing what's going on in the sprint, I mean, at the moment it's slightly confusing to be fair, but if you locate the sprint, for example, here we're in tasks. Of course, you should probably be careful when you click on a node like task because there's a lot of them. But if I can click on the task, and hopefully around here we're gonna have, here we go. These are all tasks. So I'm just going to choose a random task here. It's a bit slow because it's really not designed for thousands of links. So here's a task, and this task belongs to the story. I mean, in the future, what you will see is you open up this task, you will see the plan that the LLM created. You'll see where the LLM is on that plan, and any other comments the LLM may have, and then you can see, and that's a System 1 LLM. System 2 LLM will contain all the tasks in the story in execution order, as you see here. I thought we actually changed this to become a table, but and if you're interested in knowing what's going on in that sprint, again, same thing, you can go up and understand what's going on in that sprint. And here is the table. You can see all the stories in the sprint, what's going on with those stories. You have links to all the stories. And of course, you can keep going up. So if you want to know what we're up to in this version, again, same thing. You can see all the sprints for the version and the current sprint there. Yeah, so it was quite a lot of work, a lot of sort of boring, mind-numbing work to reshape all the documentation in this shape. And we don't really have the evidence yet that this will work, but we think it will. It certainly is not going to be any worse than we currently have because we can't find anything at the moment. So this at least seems promising. And as you can see here, it's all, and like I say, we tried to make everything a regular Emacs document, so there's nothing special here. You are just dealing with typical, if I go up to recipes, whatever recipe you like. How do I add a new account? This might not be something you want to do right now. That's maybe if I get some help. So if this works as expected. Okay, so the problem with this is the reason why this is failing, classic demo. The reason why this is failing is because there are a set of extensions that we've done that are needed because, of course, we have multiple environments, so it needs to know where to look. And we have addressed this. If you go in Lisp, you'll see that we have this Babel here, and Babel, in theory, is responsible for. You can choose presets and so on, and then this will tell it where to look for the binaries. Now, of course, as with many things at the moment, there's lots of stuff that are not quite finished. This is one of those. This is not very far off. All we need to do is, in the Babel setup, we just need to have an option here in Emacs where we could say, I'm on, I don't know, environments, and then just list the preset, which is this guy here. And then with the preset, then that will then resolve. So this call that we've made here, CLI help. The call we made here, it needs to know what the current working directory here is, which is relative to the preset. And this will, and I'm pretty sure it was working, as you can see here, but it will trigger the commands in the right location. And then if you want to change that preset to be something else, then you would run a command here, set the preset, which will be sort of an Emacs global thing. And so, yeah, this is very advantageous because it basically means that everything we've got here, whatever it is, you can actually run it like if it was an IPython notebook, for instance. So, for instance, all the queries that we got here, you can execute those queries. Again, same thing, you'd have to choose what database you're pointing to, which will be an environment like local 1 or so on. And it will all execute within Emacs, and then you can see all the results. I mean, of course, these days, the LLMs, we don't actually do a lot of that, but it is good to be able to do that when you want to. So I think that's all for documentation. As you can see as well, we removed a lot of fluff. This page was quite large before. Now everything is a bit more focused. If you want to know how to do things, we now point to recipes, and recipes contain the steps and link to further documentation. So it's more like a wiki, but it's also a knowledge graph, which is what we wanted to do really. Right, so that was one of the dominant themes of the sprint. And I think we kind of covered it well enough. As you saw there, the build is a bit red. So we spoke about visibility, we spoke about the documentation. Before we left for, oh actually the Quant Summit, let's just very briefly talk about Quant Summit. So I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I will point you in the right direction. So if you go to my home page, there is now an ORE Studio page. So as part of the cleanup of the documentation, we removed all the documents that we didn't think were, well, just basically personal opinions really, rather than actually the main stuff. So this was moved here. So if you want to know, I don't know, my opinions on computational finance, what we think it is and so on, or if you want to know what I think about finance and modeling, those things are no longer in ORE Studio, they are now on my personal website. And I also linked to the videos. It will also be linked in the ORE Studio website, but you can have you have a link here, and I'll keep these up to date. And more to the point, I will start doing some blog posts, such as, for example, on the cybernetic approach. I think that will be simultaneously a paper and a blog post, I think. So I created a quick blog post for the Quant Leap Summit, which sort of summarizes what happened there, a couple of pictures I took. It sort of references the slides that were published by LSE. So if you scroll, in fact I'll start from the top. Yeah, as you can see here, there's some addendums where if you click on these things, you will have access to the links that are provided to me by LSE. And you also have a sort of a short summary of what happened in the Quant Summit. So we're not going to take too long here talking about it, since you can read it over in my website. So that's the Quant Summit. So finally then, the actual work on the application itself. So what we're going to do is, we're just going to try to do a demo here of some of the stuff that we've been working on. So I've started the services already. And I think I've started the client as well. Actually, one of the things that's worth mentioning, we were having a lot of annoying problems with the environment, where we kept changing the environment and not knowing what version of the environment we're in, and so that resulted in extremely hard to debug errors. So for instance, you'd be missing an environment variable, that environment variable would expand to say null, and then you'd have an error 5 kilometers down the road, which was completely nonsensical. So now we're actually tracking the environment via versioning, and then whenever you run scripts, it checks to see the expected version versus the required version. And so all you need to do is, every time you change the environment, you need to bump up the version. Your .env will contain a version on it, and when you run the scripts, if that does not match the expected version, then it will not run, which is quite an easy way of knowing if you're not up to date. So whenever you run any of the major scripts that require an environment, it will do that check. Also, one of the things I was playing around with is I had an SSD, so I moved over to the SSD. The reason why you now see a lot of these things with starts and ends was because this was all running in the rotational drive, and it was extraordinarily slow, and so I didn't quite know why. And then I realized it was just the rotational drive was just too slow. And the SSD now, everything is working a lot better. So, but now a lot of the scripts have got these timestamps to tell us how fast things are going. So anyway, we just recreated this environment. This is the serving over the website I mentioned. So what I'll do is, oh, actually another change that we just did, or the first change. Let's use our super secure passwords that we use for everything. For development-wise, of course. We changed connection manager. One of the problems we used to have a connection manager, which was really annoying, previous sprint, was you would see every connection for every environment. But in reality, most of the time, you don't really care about every connection, every environment. You care about the environment you're in. So it was really painful because you can never find anything. So now we have a notion of an environment which is supplied when you start the client. You just, if you have a look at start client, you'll see, I mean, this is a bit of a long script, but you have things such as instance name, instance color, and other variables that are used to configure the UI. Here we're not using colors, but at least we have the environment, which is really useful because not only because now if I got 3 or 4 UIs, I know which one is which, but also because I can use that to filter. So I now see, according to these labels, I see what I want to see, which is the connections for the environment. So here I'm going to log in with my superadmin account. This is a fresh environment because I recreated the database, and it defaults to my connection password, and I'm just going to create a tenant, just our default tenant, and you can use whatever you want in the Glaive set. I've recorded the password, so I'm just going to copy it again. So as before, this is just going to go away and provision a tenant, right? So now what you can do is you can disconnect and then reconnect, and when you reconnect, you can now use the tenant account on that type of tenant. Now, as before, once you log in with a tenant for the first time, you also get a wizard for initialization. The wizards, all the steps have changed because they are now workflow based. So we collect all the data that we need up front before we run the wizard. So in this case, for example, we're asking what is the root of the house of this system, and in this case, we just chose the parent company of the Barclays Group. You can choose whatever you want. So here you see one of the changes that we've done. So this is now linking into the workflows because in the past we were halfway through our monolithic to service-based architecture migration. So we were calling store procs from all sorts of places, from different services and so on, which was not ideal really. It meant that we couldn't really permission services properly. So now we're trying to be quite strict of the grants. So if you're a service, you can only see your service tables, and you may be able to reference read-only some other tables, but in general, you can only see yours. So this is now executing a workflow. The workflow has got a number of steps. You can see the steps here, and the setup is complete. And so the initialization of the tenant is complete. The menus have changed as well because we're getting a little bit confusing. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. What I really want is operations. So the menus have changed, so I'm a bit lost. So in operations, you can see we just run this workflow. We don't have any active workflows, nothing has failed. And in the workflow, if there was errors, you'll be able to see the errors here of the workflow. So that was very useful because in the past, it was very hard to figure out when something went wrong. So I'm now going to log in after I've done all of the initialization of the tenants. Now, as you can see here, we have parties. So I'm just going to choose one of the parties. Those are obviously all the parties that are available on the group. And now we need to set up counterparties, reports, and so on. So the three-step process, as it was before, is still, as you can see here, this is not quite fleshed out. We still need some work on these dialogues. So we've initialized the system, then we initialize the tenant, now we're initializing the party. And now the party is being initialized. And now we can disconnect and connect. And at this point in time, the system is more or less ready to be used. As you can see here, it remembers the last party you used, which is useful. And now we're logged in with an initialized system. So the first change that the last change that we did, it's probably fair, is we started introducing yet another of these splits that we've got. So as I said, we have a system. The system has tenants. The tenants can have multiple parties, and the parties now have a notion of workspaces. So it may sound a little bit complicated. If you're not familiar with RISC systems, this may sound a bit crazy, but the reason why you need workspaces is because, one of the great objectives that we have is we need to import ORE data. And the ORE data, the samples, as I can show you here, the samples are sort of self-contained units. So if I go to external and ORE and the examples here, so each of these guys here, so for example, if I go to an academy example, this is a self-contained unit that contains all of the market data, all the conventions, everything you need to value. And the ORE XML is roughly what we call a report. Now, if you were to import, as we tried, and the reason why I know this is because I tried, if you were to import every single sample, you would end up with an inconsistent environment, because you're going to have the superset of all the market data for every single sample created by ORE, and you will also have every single configuration that you've got. And these things are not really designed to all coexist in one big gigantic space. So really what you want is to create workspaces, probably one per sample, and in those workspaces you can, well, it's like a mini cube that you can play around with. Of course, in the future, we will want to import every single trade into a common workspace, but then we will need to generate our own market data based on the supplied market data, and we will need to ensure that each trade evaluates or prices with that market data, the synthetic market data that we'll generate. But it is not possible to just take the superset of all the market data and all the configs in the samples. They're not designed that way. I mean, I don't have a proof for this because I didn't go as far as that, because we don't really have end-to-end work yet. But I think it is fair to say that's very likely. And so the way this works is you have the notion of a workspace, you choose a workspace, and then when you start to open elements that live in a workspace, such as, for example, books, you can see these views. Think of a workspace a bit like a branch, effectively. Not everything, of course, is branched. So, for instance, currencies are common. So I'm not entirely sure why. We're quite slow to start dialogues. We definitely need to look into this, because we should not be holding on to the main UI thread when we open up a dialogue. But that seems to be what we're doing. So as you can see here, we don't bother showing the workspace here, because there's only one workspace for all the parties, because these are all the currencies. But things like books and also portfolios and so on, those belong to a workspace, and of course the same for market data. Now, we haven't quite finished this. We started the work, but we haven't quite finished it. So as you will see in a second, portfolios are coming up empty. The reason why is purely because there's some kind of bug in the workspace selection, so it's not finding the live workspaces. So that's workspaces. This will be quite active, an active area of work for the next release, next sprint. In addition to workspaces, let's have a look. As I said, we did a lot of security work on service-based decoupling, basically, so that services go across NATs and talk to other services. We did a lot of work on cleaning up generated code, so that most of the stuff is coming from CodeGen. More to go on that, but we do need to work on that. But also there was a lot of work, this is related to what I meant about decoupling, DQ publish, one of the aspects where we were calling procs directly across services, which was not a good idea. We also did some work on ORE conventions, but again we can't see this yet because there are bugs with the way they interface with workspaces, which is not ideal. And I think, I mean, there was lots and lots of bits and pieces, but I think, like for example, actually, I can't actually demo this. I could have showed you an example of an instrument, but the problem is I can't actually import an instrument because, as I said, workspaces are not quite working. So if I was to try to import, it would not be visible because it's going to be in a workspace that we can't reach. But we have worked a lot on FX instruments and the ability to see the trade in instrument for a given product type. Lots of round-tripping work and other assorted features. But I think with this, I mean, this is already becoming quite a long presentation. I think with this we covered the majority of the key work. I think you can have a quick look at the release notes. Again, all of this is auto-generated from the LLM. I don't think there's anything I can think of off the top of my head that is worth mentioning here. Otherwise, this will actually be a never-ending presentation. So yeah, I think that's about it for this demo. We are doing quite a lot of good progress. We still haven't managed to stabilize the application, but I'm hoping that the next release will be a little bit more stable. We will mop things up with workspaces, which will then enable us to create this sort of provisional blotter, which I don't have a good name for it. but it will be the place where all the imports go to before they hit the system. And then once they're in the provisional plotter, then they can go into a workspace. And from the workspace, then you will be able to see all the trades again. So you just have to select the trades for a given workspace here. And that should just work. That's something for next sprints. As I said, there was lots of changes in there in the menu system. And I think, but not a lot in terms of functionality in that sense. It's just what was needed to just make things slightly less confusing. I think the rest is that. I think the rest we've already covered, so just functionality that we already had before this sprint. So I'm not going to waste time on that. So I think that's it for today, I think. Okay, thanks for watching. If I can find